Last week we talked about invasive species, or those that displace native species within a habitat as they spread rapidly. We said this was a reflection of the competition exclusion principle, which states that if two species share a niche, one will eventually outcompete and displace the other. We said that invasive species tend to share at least a few of several kinds of characteristics that help them to become invasive. That they can grow rapidly and have large numbers of offspring, and that those offspring can withstand harsh conditions. We said that invasive species often can travel long distances, either by themselves or with human activity, and that they have few or no predators that control their population. They tend to come from similar climates or conditions as the habitats that they're invading. They tend to have multiple reproductive strategies, and they tend to lack specific needs. In other words, we tend to consider invasive species to be habitat generalists, meaning they lack specific requirements for their survival in a habitat and therefore can survive in multiple kinds of habitats. This is the opposite of a habitat specialist, which has very specific and very rigid requirements for their survival. A habitat specialist tends to be most at risk when an invasive species is introduced into an ecosystem. Lastly, we said that there are two forms of human activity that aid the spread of invasive species: transportation and disturbances. Transportation is necessary to introduce a new species into an ecosystem, while human-caused disturbances enable them to get a foothold and become established in that ecosystem. While there are different ways of treating invasive species once they are established in an ecosystem, the only way to completely prevent or stop damage from invasive species is to prevent their introduction into an ecosystem. This week we'll move on to the third major cause of extinction: pollution. Pollution is any substance or thing that reduces ecosystem services, biodiversity, and/or carrying capacity. We will briefly touch on light and noise pollution at the start of this week, but spend most of our time this week talking about soil and water pollution. Next week we'll spend the entire time talking about air pollution. While we tend to think of pollutants as being these inherently dangerous substances like toxic sludge or black smoke, anything can become a pollutant if it exists at a high enough level or concentration that it interrupts ecosystem function and services. What makes something a pollutant is not as much about its intrinsic qualities as whether or not it exists in high enough levels or concentrations to cause a habitat disturbance. Our schedule this week will be similar as in previous weeks. On day one, you'll have case studies. These are slightly different from data dives in that case studies focus more on real-world scenarios than on data analysis. For your case studies, you will need to use credible internet sources to understand how and why these situations occurred. On day two, you'll have core ideas. On day three, you'll do one of three kinds of investigations. On day four, you'll have review and assessment. And on day five, if there's time, you'll be doing career and community connections.